Here we go. The illustrious Johnny Fincham. So nice to see you and exchange wisdom and see how we have grown in our understanding. Are you still growing in your understanding of
Yeah,
hands?
yeah. I've just done 3 months of study in deep scientific papers on dermatoglyphics on the print patterns and links to various diseases. So I've just written a book on health and the hand, medical hand reading.
When is that coming up?
Oh, May that's coming out.
I can't wait to get that.
It's a hell of a read. I mean, there are so many thousands of papers I'd never heard of. Some are absolutely astounding, just stuff I'd never been aware of. I don't know how you classify the skin texture of the palm. I don't know whether you
I
grade
do.
it in different ways, but the finest skin type I call silk skin, which is covered with hair scratchy lines, extremely fine dermal ridges, and that type I call the silk skin. It's found on about 3 or 4% of men, about 18% of females. Um, and that actually has been shown to show a much greater propensity to die of shock. So if you get run over, break a leg or something, your hypersensitivity is so great that your whole system gets overwhelmed and you're much more likely to die of shock. Isn't that astounding? But it sort
That
of makes
doesn't
sense.
surprise me a bit how sensitive that hand. I have an illustration of that type of skin that you're talking about. I named it kind of water skin because I was always classifying things by earth, air, fire, water. I'm like addicted to seeing the world in an elemental terms. And
No, that's how I always used to class it. But I find that when I teach it, people don't understand a word of what I'm saying. If you sort of say silk, because it's like silk,
yes, you're good
people
with
seem to
that.
get it much quicker.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so silk
yeah,
skin, right? That's the
yeah,
baby's bottom over to the right.
yeah. That's right. Yeah. Often it's covered with tiny, tiny hair, like very fine, scratchy lines. Yeah,
Barely make those out, right? It's like a
yeah.
thumb, amount of sensitivity.
You can only really tell the skin by feel. You have to physically be there. That's why I don't do online readings because I like to grab hold of the hand and maul it about and touch and feel it because then you can see how flexible the fingers are and exactly how coarse the skin is. Because sometimes people have quite what I call podgy skin. It's quite moist, but actually it may not be very silky at all. When you feel the ridges, they're quite coarse, but it
Mm.
can appear to be very silky and soft when you first touch it, but it's just moisture in it. So you really do need to be able to kind of grab people and feel their hands, I think, to be able to get a really good sense of their skin texture.
Especially you bend the thumb. That's the most important part. You cannot see by a photograph is
Yeah.
bend how far, how oaky that thumb is in terms of their willpower and sense of control.
I always see it as people's grip, their sense of their grip on themselves. And it does relate to the grip. Obviously, if you grip something very tightly and strongly, you develop that muscle and you develop that stiffness of the thumb. And it has people with a stiff thumb have much tighter grip on themselves. They don't let go easily. They stick to their task stronger. They're
Yeah.
floppy ones. I'm surrounded by musicians these days, so I play a bit of guitar. And it's astounding how many musicians have these floppy thumbs. They're sort of, sorry, man, I'm 2 hours late. Yeah, I just got chatting to the neighbor. They would not have your Swiss precision about time. They wouldn't last 30 seconds with your sense of getting somewhere on time. Their slack thumbs, sort of drift in and out of things very, in a very relaxed way.
Yeah, that's a brilliant, brilliant way of seeing it. Having a grip on their life. What did you find out about the other skin types? Did you see that the earth guys have any disease types or fire or
Yeah.
air?
Yeah, the best way I can put it really is the two extremes were the most powerful and important in terms of health. So the silk skin, much more likely to die of shock, much more easily overwhelmed by various fevers and disease patterns, much more likely to suffer from psychological problems, neurosis, fears, anxieties, that sort of thing, as you would expect. But with the coarsest, thicker skins, exactly the opposite. They'll kind of break a leg and sort of strap it up with a couple of belts and sort of limp on and carry on working. They'll get an infection and they won't bother to clear it out. And so they are, because they're so extraordinarily strong and incredibly hardy and outdoorsy types, they put up with an enormous amount of sort of abuse. They think people like homeopaths are just a joke, they sort of laugh at alternative medicine and it's all ridiculous. But then actually they start to suffer pretty serious illnesses by the time they get to their 50s. And so it's that old Chinese saying, weak man, careful health, live long time. Strong man, ignore health, die young. And it's absolutely true. They're so tough and hardy. They sort of knock themselves around, live on bacon sandwiches and roll up cigarettes and burn themselves out and have arthritis and all sorts of problems of neglect and often die younger than average because of their own kind of toughness, which is astounding, really, isn't it? If you get the odd person that does have coarse skin and that actually lives a healthy life, exercises, plenty of fresh air, good vegetarian or mainly vegetarian diet because they can't clog up quite easily, they live forever, They go on for years and years and years and years. They're sort of 98-year-olds. But all too rarely, they don't usually look after themselves. So that's a bit of a hit. Yeah. And unexpectedly so.
And
Yeah.
the fire, I guess I have to credit you for giving me that wonderful tidbit of knowledge, which I refer time and time again, that if you shock your brain with 3 months of electric shock therapy, your hands explode with lines, which shows how neurotic these fire people are with their crazy fire lines. Yeah. And so did you see any propensity for any disease for fire hands?
Mainly, well, interestingly enough, I found the most likely process for fire people and what you might call fire skin or grainy skin was accidents. They're always leaping around the place and damaging themselves, but usually they're the most likely to keep fit. They're always doing sporty things. They're very dynamic. They tend to, leap around the place. So they're sort of, as long as they don't drug themselves stupid, because of course they're so dynamic, they tend to often take on a lot of soporific drugs, to kind of calm themselves down and smoke a lot of skunk and that sort of thing. But generally, yeah, accidents was a big thing. Also, amazingly, that was linked to tented arch prints too.
Accident prone. I totally am. I have, two tenant arches. And,
Ah,
and
yeah.
so I'm absolutely accident prone. I'm not in my body. I'm not, spatially aware. So I'm a complete dork. I've always been.
Well, I think also tented arches tend to have a propensity to do something, to live rather dramatic and exciting
Yes.
times. They tend to have a sense where, I mean, like a lady I was talking to the other day, gentle soul, water hand, and I went on this spiritual quest in South America, and our guide said it was a bit dangerous in the jungle. We were going to go to this sort of temple. So we abandoned the guide and took a donkey on and took the most amazing kind of risks. And I think that's the thing about tented archers. They tend to kind of push things pretty far, and they very often tend to get involved in pretty exciting, sporty things. They tend to sort of have this sense of dashing in and not having enough care. There isn't a sort of strong sense of caution. I think they tend to attack life. Well, you'll know this yourself. They tend to sort of grab life by the horns, and even if they're very gentle, sensitive types, they tend to kind of pitch into things pretty strongly. But usually, Tetradites have done something exciting and dramatic. Even the most gentle soul has probably at some time, gone snowboarding or some terrifying and dangerous thing at some point. It's just part of their kind of nature. And also,
Okay.
dental archers are more prone to heart arrhythmia, mania, and one other thing. What was the other thing? Is
Anxiety. I would say anything related to anxiety, I would
well,
think.
they have a kind of heightened response, and so they kind of get high. Yeah, you get kind of higher response. But there are some kind of lung issue to do with hypoxia where they kind of get uh, can't breathe properly. It's sort of a sort of a panic attack. There is a proper medical name for it, which sort of escapes me at the moment. But it's not the same as a panic attack. It's just a sort of sense of your whole system gets a bit overwhelmed because you're all sort of worked up and overexcited. And it's a little bit sort of like a kind of mania. And this particularly seems to affect youths with tented arches. Also, they were found in much greater numbers amongst the more competitive martial arts and competitive games. You know, things where you're sort of beating each other with sticks, slugging each other with things. And again, it's all part of the sort of nature of the tented arch. Um, I think there is always this sort of propensity to, to kind of push yourself and take on things and go to extremes. It's part of the nature of the tented arch, I think. Um, One thing I also noted rather alarmingly is people with high numbers of whorls. That's a bit of a danger signal in terms of heart and any issues to do with circulation. Really, that's a big, big trigger. There's some report from I believe it was from Singapore. I mean, I've been wading through thousands of papers, but I think it was a Singapore report. But they found that for every whirl, your blood pressure, the average blood pressure, comes up a little bit.
It
And so the
doesn't surprise
Germans,
me at all when you consider, these just look at the disposition of these guys, right? Those world people, I'll show you my little collection here, just that I have in my book. When you look at uh the world guys, these are the four hand types, just to understand, just so you understand how to look at this. When you organize people and play God by organizing people by hand type, you got I call it the airy guys that love patterns and wear patterns. And then you got the water people that, are sensitive, and they're living completely different lives. He has never taken his half naked body on Instagram the way she loves to do on a very regular basis. So
I'm
these
sure.
guys don't, that they live completely different lives. Even Jodie Foster can't wear a good dress. And then you got your fire, short fingers, crazy lines. Uh, and then, the big square, you can drive a
Yeah,
tractor over that. So
yeah.
when I take those four hands and I do nothing but just put an abundance of whirls or loops or tenon arches or whatever, you get this combination that's really amusing to see. So she's got six whirls, right? See how busy these guys are. She can't just go jogging. She's got to be a triathlete. And he can't be an engineer. He's got to build the biggest tunnel in Switzerland. Can't be a physicist.
Yeah.
He's got to run 15,000. He can't be a life coach. He's got to be Tony Robbins. Now look how they change this is the same hand type, but look how lovable these guys are when they have waves on their fingers. All right. There's a lot of waves. And then arches, guys in survival a lot.
Now, hang on. What do you mean by what you mean loops when you're talking about waves? Do you?
Yeah, I
Yeah,
say,
yeah,
I
yeah,
say
yeah.
waves. I know. I got caught on calling them waves a long time ago because people didn't get loops very well.
Well, they are wave-like. It's probably a better description, really.
And then our tenant arch guys. Look how are they in a love story? Nope. And are they in a service of trying to do everything for everybody story? Nope. Tenant arch people have this kind of disposition being a little bit edgy and distant and in their mental and a little
Yeah,
anxious and
yeah. Higher pitched.
higher
In a
pitch.
way,
Say,
in a way, you could see them as being almost like the kind of rhythm of their lives, the whole way that the print runs. The low, flat, simple arches have a deeper, slower, more kind of gutsy kind of rhythm, and they're much more kind of clingy, much more passive, much more sedentary, and much slower. And the tented arch is the highest pitch; it sort of waves up in a great shooting. And then your whirl is sort of around going round and round and round and round. They're sort of like boring drills that drill into things very deeply.
mm,
You did get very academic people with lots of whirls, and they tend to just again, just bore on and go deeper and deeper and deeper. They'll
mm.
take things further, but in a very much more sort of intellectual way.
Yeah,
Uh,
and in a circumstantial way. I think they're more keen to the circumstances around them versus these guys that are in their head.
well, the most affected by environment is, of course, the radial loop, which I think in some mad process of Richard Unger completely ignores, but the radial loop is incredibly affected by people and situations around them. Do you have a radial loop on your hand? I can't
I
remember you.
do. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
oh,
One
okay.
of your
Well,
students was like,
the radial loop is nothing like the normal loop at all. Nothing like an ulnar loop. Radial loop is much, much rarer. Has enormous consequences on the person that has one. So if you got one,
yeah,
it will.
look at it. Right. So if you look
Yeah,
at these, you got these waves for people who don't know what a radial loop is. You got these waves that are coming in saying, "Hey, I love the party. Thank you very much. Goodbye." They come around toward the thumb and then they exit the same door that they came. Whereas this guy is coming up and he's just saying, "Hey, I'm going to go the opposite direction." Opposite direction, right? And I only see it on the index finger, though I'm
it's
sure it exists in others.
it's very, very rare to see on any of the other. I think it's something 1 in 280 of the middle fingers have a radial loop. But the radial loop has massive consequences. I think it's the most powerful sign. It gives a constant insecurity, a sense of desperately wanting to please people, not to offend them. You get it on the kind of super nice person. There is always a sense where they're extremely affected by the people and situations around them. And there's a sense of always trying to kind of accommodate other people and to connect with other people. The radial loop is one of the most intuitive signs as well on the hand. Anybody with a radial loop on the index is always highly intuitive and has a desperate need to please and to connect with others. The thing is, if you have that, Brent, you've got to be careful that you're not a super pleaser because they tend to be super pleasers. Want to make everybody happy, everybody content, everybody kind of sweet, don't want to have any conflict with anybody, and that can be difficult, particularly in hand reading, because sometimes in hand reading you have to talk about pretty tough things, don't you? And you have to kind of say, well, this is not a good sign we're seeing here. We need to kind of look at this more deeply and we need to examine the roots of this. And, you can't always have a positive spin on things. And it does mean, I think radial loops are more prone to immune system issues, particularly things like Wales disease, which is a kind of a sort of inflammation and swelling. And you can't help thinking the immune system is in a way you're reacting to other people and responding to other people. So you will know this very well. But if you're in a hostile environment or people that are quite negative or quite difficult or quite critical, it can really, really affect you very seriously and sort of psychologically, and you can find it very hard to kind of carry on. And there is a sort of a sense of like a wave sweeping in of other people around you, kind of overwhelming you. And people with radial lips very often, there's usually points in lives where they do feel overwhelmed. They can't quite cope, particularly in relationships and intimate relationships. There's a sort of sense of you need to kind of come back up for air and get away from people every so often. So they love their own space. They need a little capsule to kind of get away. Can't possibly be with somebody else in a room all the time because it's like you're sucking in their energy. You can't help it. That radial lip is like a great leak. It's like a puncture in the self that's sort of sucking in air. And one's own sort of ego, one's own sense of self is escaping all the time. So it's a very sort of vulnerable quality. And I don't know why Richard Unger doesn't mention it at all. It's absolutely mad. It's not in his system at all. But then, as you know, I don't really agree with the Richard Unger system. I think I love the fact that he's put the fingerprints first and foremost and made that a really, really powerful part of hand reading because it's been ignored for years. But the whole life purpose thing, I don't agree with at all, as I'm sure we've said before. But the
Yeah,
rate,
he does count it, but he counts it in a point system.
yeah,
And
it's ridiculously simplistic. And I think the simple arts doesn't have any points at all because it doesn't have any tri-radii or something.
well, how do
But
you distinguish the right radial loop to the left? I think that's because I find the highest number of relationships where these guys have a great casualty rate of being in a narcissistic relationship because
radio loop people,
yeah,
yeah, they do. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm afraid. Well, again, it's that kind of need to please, and that's that vulnerability, you see. So there is a sense where, in a way, one is very easily get to the situation of being the feeder of some sort of hungry beast type ego, if you see what I mean. I mean, it works very well. I mean, it's a perfect job for you if you're hand reading. I mean, because in a way, it's a very sympathetic and very intuitive and very hyper receptive quality. I often call the radial loop the hyper receptive loop because it's hyper-receptive, hypersensitive.
Mm.
So in a way, it's a very good pattern to have for anybody that's working within the realm of caring or being receptive to other people. So look after your immune system,
So on
Brent.
the right index finger, I would observe that as being kind of hypersensitive toward, criticism for other people or egos. They don't want to be an ego. Whereas if it's on the left, I would say it is being somebody who is kind of in the same way, not really able to stand up for their confidence and what their
Yeah,
desires are. So if somebody's coming around with very strong expectations, they're very willing to go along with it, or they need,
yeah.
and there's also rebellious nature in both those cases.
Well,
They
it's like getting overwhelmed. You sort of, it's too much coming in, so you have to kind of get away and get space. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, in a way, it gives a sort of insecurity. It's interesting, you don't ever see a radio loop running a whole business. They're nearly always a second in command or somebody who starts an offshoot or a branch because they don't sort of want to be in the situation where they're going to be, having to give lots of orders and commands and run other people around. Radio loops don't like to do that. They like to nurture, they like to cherish, they like to kind of feed and to give to other people. But yeah, it's not a good position to be if you want to be in a situation to sort of hire people and fire people, because that's not being terribly nice to them. Yeah, well, again, you know all this, I'm sure.
Yeah, I've been looking at and I'm curious how you have come to the conclusion around the direction of the wave, what that means for the brain. All right. So
Yeah,
we know that the right hand is linked to the left brain. That's science,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
Left
Uh-huh.
hand to the right brain, and you got these three nerves. You got the radial, and you got the medial that branches out to these three guys, and then you have the ulnar nerve. And what's interesting is you can go into Chat GPT and you can literally say, all right, given the work that the nervous system anthropologically has grown in to direct with the index finger or control with the thumb, and we see things in a holographic way when we're talking about the left hand, and the right is more literal, and we're talking, given the combination, what would that mean if you have a left thumb versus right thumb? And it nails it. It nails all of them perfectly as to what the fingerprints mean and the routing of that and the experience of that. So is a great uh, understanding that can be grounded biologically as to why the fingerprints relay certain experiences. I'll give you an example.
I think a good way of thinking about them is
Yeah.
kind of mind waves, literally the waves of the mind. Because if you
Mm.
think about it, and we talked about, you describing the loop as a kind of wave, you could see almost a kind of cosmic ocean of sort of thinking patterns, and the simple arch having a much more kind of figurative, pragmatic, sort of simpler, doesn't like big leaps, where the tented arch is the opposite of that. It does make big leaps. It has this hyper expectations of things, it wants to look in a very grandiose way and wants to change the world and change other people. But the simple arch doesn't. It's sort of, hang on, that's all a bit too adventurous for me. Let's take. So in a way, we see them as the way of the waves of the mind sort of thinking. It works very well like that. The way the mind is wired almost. It's almost like the wiring of the way the brain is kind of configured. That
Yeah.
works very well. Yeah,
We should be able
absolutely.
to see that on a PET scan at some point, or the fact that we know, for example, that twins separated from birth, when the Jim twins that find out that they have 39 years later, the twin,
Yeah,
they, uh, they had the exact same, uh, they had the same attraction to the same type of wife. So the wife was very, they could have been sisters, right? And they both named their son James Allen and their dog Toy, and they made this weird
yeah.
stuff in the backyard. But they also had the same brain waves, and they had obviously the same fingerprints as twins too. So those brain waves, that was a very interesting thing, that they when you go and they go, they have the same brain waves. And so that means, I think you're right on. I think that if we go deeper into the study of brain waves, we'll be able to recognize what the composite is doing You know, why is it, what's the difference between a composite doing this and that one that goes like that? There's,
Yeah, yeah.
do you have a theory on that? Why the composite, what, have you seen the difference? I haven't been able to recognize. I just go, wow, you're topsy-turvy. But when it's going like this versus that, when these guys do that, I find that is really, really unique. They're really trying to get a kind of a crazy take in their life, like a photographer who's really going in a real adventuresome swing. They're real oddballs, like they were really weird people.
But in a way, they're inconclusive because, of course, the mind waves are in two opposite polarities. So, in a way, in that particular area that finger rules, they have a sense of really an ambiguity. That's why it's so common on academics, because academics don't think in black and white. They think about things in a way in which, well, if we look at it this way, it's like that. We look at it this way, it's like that. And academics are really very reluctant to make any kind of serious conclusions about anything. And if you look at Karl Popper, Karl Popper, who came out with Conjectures and Refutations, the basic book on how scientific theory is built. He says, well, science is not actually a fixed, rigid process. It's a process. Obviously, Karl Popper had two composites. He says, well, science says this theory works brilliantly for now. Every time we do this experiment at 28.9 degrees, we get this boiling water geyser effect. So this is actually theory that come out to 29.9 degrees. This is when what, however, somebody might come along with a better theory or another way of looking at it another time. So, for the moment, this is what we
For
say.
the moment, it's fine.
Yeah, so we think of science as being a very rigid, mathematical almost, but it isn't at all. It's actually, well, we'll go along with this idea for now, but if, another one comes,
Yeah.
so a composite has this wonderful ability to kind of never be absolutely sure. And it's always sort of searching for the kind of solution, but is always kind of shifting like a seesaw from seeing things one side and the other. I mean, I remember when my degrees in literature and film, and I
Mm.
remember a rather wonderful teacher, David, who was one of our lecturers, but he had this wonderful way of kind of, you'd read a book and you'd sort of talk about it, and you'd talk about it well from a feminist perspective, from a historical perspective. Well, if we go back to a kind of perspective where we're looking at this from a kind of neo-historical point, and then if we look at it from a rationalist, and he'd have these 45 different ways and angles of seeing any particular piece of art. And in a way, you just ended up with this great big basket of views and opinions and values, but he would never kind of push you to one or the other. And so it just sort of opened everybody up rather than close them down. So if you were a
It's on the
feminist,
left thumb. I notice they are super restless, and I can get normally 10 to 15, 20 locations that they have moved to in the last 10 years, right? So it's like ants in their pants when it's on the left thumb.
yeah, I mean, in a way, they're also very loath to
Mm,
commit to any home, to any wife or husband,
mm.
to any partner. There's always a loathe to absolutely commit. They'll sort
To
of keep.
hold on to anything, thumb. Yeah.
Yeah, 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 of course. Yeah, exactly.
Mm.
So, they're kind of always hanging about. Oh, sorry, I just got an alarm going off. It's just reminding me I've got somebody coming for a reading in 15 minutes. So sorry about this, Brett. We're going to sort of have to wrap things. We've got 15 more minutes. So,
I'll
um,
drink it up for 15 minutes. No.
so a couple of other things about the research I've been doing. A
Yeah.
couple of combinations which are really worrying, and that is if you have, the triradius where the ridges meet into a kind of a triangular pattern near the base of the palm.
Yeah.
You've got a lot of whorls and a raised axial triradius. So rather than being here, it's sort of here somewhere.
Right.
That's a really, really, really serious, emergency. You've got to sort of give that person a really good talking to. No smoking, no stress, exercise, have blood pressure checked regularly. Very, 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 very dangerous combination. Very high chance of congenital heart disease. And these people tend to kind of suddenly pop, bang, and something goes wrong. So the combination of more than four whorls and a raised axial triradius, that was one of the big standout patterns that I found in the hand health-wise. That came up again and again and again when you have those two together.
What about Asperger's? Did you see the correlation with the missing triradius here, where it just makes a big smiley face of ridge pattern all the way up to here? Have you seen that? Where these guys are really super kind of outsider, not wanting to be people.
I
Are
didn't really find enough. I there were a couple of papers on it, but I didn't really find the statistics sort of convincing enough. There was
Yeah,
always
try to
something wrong with the ring finger. There's always something wrong with the ring finger, definitely, which I call the peacock finger, the finger of
yeah.
display and showing off of her. The finger being super long, the finger having some kind of a weird whirl or a pattern under it, but there wasn't really a conclusive incidence that was statistically big enough. I mean, in my book, I've only used the really big statistics where they've gone a couple of thousand people. So when there are just a few, just a couple of hundred, I don't really see that as sort of convincing enough. But there definitely is a link between that and Asperger's, something wrong with the ring finger and something not kind of, it's either overdeveloped, underdeveloped, or there's something blocking or something not working in it.
Yeah, so I have seen, because I'm shifting people, that is, I take people into an understanding of their shadow side and how they act in a protective way. And when they go through a revolution, essentially, the with their sense of understanding, like at this point, it's an academic understanding because they've just had a
Well,
hand analysis.
sorry, Brent, I'm just going to interrupt you there. Sorry, darling.
Apologies, Mr. Fincham, your next client is waiting.
Oh, okay. I'll just tell her to wait. I'll be with her in a few minutes. Yeah. Thank
Thank
you ever
you.
so much. Yeah. Sorry, Brent, do carry on.
So you can see that she's in her shadow and she's like got the pitted and her hand's a bit scaly and there's a little bit of blue underneath. When I shifted her, meaning that I put and used the language of the limbic brain, which is not English, but rather images of her memories, and I had them come up and she dealt with those memories in a shadow board, her hand changes. And so what I'm observing, what is happening to these people who go through this shift process where their lines tend to disappear, and we're talking weeks, just a few weeks after this. I mean, look at this guy, ling ling, or this woman right here, ling ling. So what's happening there is I have been observing that they go, when you go in a protective pattern, or let's say the automatic nervous system pattern, going, I got to survive this, that is visible by the shape of the hand, how you act when you're in survival or in stress, clearly, right? And what triggers you is largely granted by the fingerprints. So you can look at it in this way, that you have, you're happy and as a clam in your nice little wave here, but then you get anxious. You get anxious if you get overstimulated or understimulated, or an increase of ego or no ego. And what I'm doing is helping them develop the skills to look at that. And the way I do it is I go and have them do literally a shadow board of everything I said in the handreading, everything limiting I see. And so what I've started to research, given that you're doing this disease work, you're at the impact of what I'm seeing. If they stay in their shadow, let's say they're staying 70%, that means that their immune system is, of course, oppressed. That means that the longer they're in a disassociated state, then what happens? Their immune system can't calm down. So when they get out of that and they can look at the images and then finally create a new sense of life, then they live that life. And I say, go live that life. And they create all these actual photos. So coming to the point of what I'm working with right now is we've got this fight, flight, freeze, fawn response. And different people go into a fight response because, Donald Trump and all those guys, they don't go into a fawning. They go into a fight because they're already naturally assertive by character. So you just push them in a state and they're going to be into more of the autocrat. Whereas other people, because they're in a love and service mindset, tend to be more fawning. Or other people that have like an air hand or tendon arches might be a little bit more in a contracting space or isolated when they feel unsafe, or they recognize that the amygdala is seeing a threat, and then the hypothalamus is, of course, referring to exactly how you're going to behave. And it runs into, if you understand Shirzad Shamin's work, which I recommend you go and read, It is fantastic in being able to understand that there's 12 sabotaging patterns that the brain goes through, control over rational, that are meaningless when the person's in it. It's just protective. But those are very visible by the shape of the hand. And you had long fingers, long palm, those guys are going to be over rational.
Well,
Whereas,
the lines are going to give you all the information you need without going anywhere else. I mean, the great thing about the lines is that they all relate to parts of the physiology and psychology. So, for instance, if somebody's got half an earth line, half of it's missing. Well, fundamentally, they're incredibly insecure. They have probably serious gut problems. They have a sense really they never feel completely safe. So all of the energy we can direct to them as readers is to build that earth line. And usually it means telling them to do exactly what they hate doing and which they want to avoid like the plague. So somebody with half an earth line needs to get up at the same time every morning, needs to get a dog, go for a walk in the fresh air, have regular meals, stay still, not travel all over the place. They're going to get really ill and exhausted because they keep burning themselves out. And all of the stuff they love doing, you have to take away from them and put them into a place where they're actually building that line. The great thing about the lines is it shows you where the weakness is in the person and exactly what directs you what advice to give them. So somebody, with a poor water line, well, obviously they have to do something which nurtures and gets them to start tuning into the outer world. So if they do something like learn the piano, they have to join a little group of people. They have to listen to everybody else. They have to develop a sense of rhythm. They have to develop a sense of harmony, and that does amazing things to the waterline. So the lines themselves gives you all the information of where to direct a person and how to develop themselves in exactly the right way. But nearly always, they absolutely bloody hate it. I mean, I used to have
exactly.
a
How
very,
do you
very,
develop the mental line, the headline? Go back in school? What?
yeah, well,
Problem
exactly.
solve?
Yeah, well, I mean, I used to have a terrible earthline. I don't know if you can see my earthline now, but
Yeah.
it's really good. But it used to be terrible. It took me years to develop it. And basically, I signed up to do yoga, and I knew I'd never last 10 minutes. So I did the teacher training course. So I had to be there and taught yoga for 30 years. And
That
so
was
I
good.
couldn't get out of it. And
I
so
love
for
that
30
approach.
years,
Don't just go attend class. Be a teacher, so you have to be accountable for it.
absolutely. And so, it developed that earthline because I had to develop routines and I had to stay healthy. I couldn't turn up there with a hangover and a roll up cigarette in my hand. I had to turn up there clean and healthy. And so it forced me into routines that developed my earthline. And this is the advice we have to give. We have to see where they're broken and give them advice to fix it. But there's no easy fixes. I mean, it takes a long time. And particularly if the line is really savagely depleted, it takes years, but it will have amazing effects. It will transform a person's life. But yeah, I mean, I think the lines gives us that information. Anyway, I'm sorry, I have a reading one. I'm sorry to cut this short, Brent. I know
Can I
you've
ask you
got an
one
hour.
last question? Run
Sure, yeah, yeah.
short. Tri-radius. What
Try
is your
red.
theory about what the function of a tri-radius is and when it goes in the middle versus to the side, or when it's missing and when it's present? What do you think that the function of that in your nervous system is?
You're thinking of that in terms of a fingerprint.
Yes.
Yeah, I see it as a geyser, as a kind of geyser that's sort of pushing an energy. If we see this as the whole print pattern, the dermal ridges as kind of waves of the mind, the way the mind kind of ellipses through thought patterns, then these are little geysers. Obviously, in a word, you have two of them that kind of putting pressure under them and making that whole process a much more intense one. So,
Mm.
in a way, the tented arch is just a great geyser. Whereas a simple arch has no geyser, so it's a very slow, plodding, much more careful and much more cautious kind of pattern.
Where is that originating in the brain, you think?
Well, it has to be. I mean, I link them really to the adrenals and the whole process of the central nervous system, because fundamentally it has to come down to the primal old part of the brain, the old sort of instinct to survive, eat, mate, it's got to be part of that. And that triggers the main kind of systems of the body, particularly the adrenals, the hypothalamus, and
Yeah.
if you like, the glandular system, the endocrinal system. There is a strong link between fingertips and different parts of the endocrinal system. That's why, ladies going through the menopause tend to develop all sorts of scratches and marks on their fingertips, because this is the endocrine system that's being triggered at that particular time. It's also very common on adolescents when they're going through puberty, because of course the endocrine system is all alive and moving and changing. So yeah, It's fundamentally that which links to the whole process of the geysers, if you like, of these
Love it.
little
I love
spurts. So sorry, Brent. I mean, this
it.
is very short.
Amazing. Love you. Love you. Love from Switzerland. And I
Love
hope we
you,
can talk
Brent.
again soon.
And yeah, I'm sorry you had to cut it so short, but all the best to you. Big
You
love,
too.
brother, and take it
I'll
easy.
post this. See ya.